Following content may contain visuals that are disturbing, graphic, or sensitive in nature. Viewer discretion is advised. This material is intended for mature audiences and may not be suitable for all viewers. Please exercise caution while watching, and if you find such content distressing, we recommend discontinuing viewing. This disclaimer is provided to ensure awareness and to prioritize viewer well being.
Hello and welcome to this brand new edition of Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. Our focus continues to be on the Israel-Hamas war. To term what's happening at Al-Shifa, the largest hospital in the besieged Gaza Strip, as a humanitarian catastrophe would be an understatement. It is now being described as a mass grave and a cemetery. Gaza's biggest hospital has buried 179 people, including babies, in a mass grave inside its compound, according to the Al-Shifa Hospital chief, Mohammed Abu Salmiya, underlining the devastating crisis in the region. He said, and I quote, "We were forced to bury them in a mass grave. There are bodies littered in the hospital complex. There is no electricity. Premature babies are being wrapped in foil to keep them alive after being removed from incubators when oxygen runs out. 7 babies and 29 patients from the intensive care unit were buried after the hospital's fuel supplies ran out." A journalist who's collaborating with news agency AFP said the stench of decomposing bodies is everywhere. A surgeon at the hospital, working with Doctors Without Borders, has called the situation inhuman. "We don't have electricity, there is no water, there is no food," he said. The Al-Shifa Hospital is Gaza City's largest and was cut off from the world for over 72 hours last week after a deadly blockade by Israeli forces that included tanks at the front gates. Israel insists the hospital sits on top of a network of tunnels that form part of Hamas's underground headquarters. Israel has accused the terror group of using hospitals and patients as human shields, an accusation that Hamas and Gaza's health officials deny. Meanwhile, Israel claims to have discovered a tunnel leading into another hospital in Gaza from the home of a known Hamas operative. According to the United Nations, thousands and perhaps more than 10,000, including patients, staff and displaced Palestinian civilians, may be inside Al-Shifa, trapped and unable to escape because of fierce fighting nearby. Al-Quds, a second major hospital in the area, has been cut off from the world for a week. Remember, hospitals and medical personnel are protected under international humanitarian law, and parties in conflict must ensure their protection. They cannot be used to shield military objectives from attack, but any operation around or within must protect patients, staff and other civilians. That's been categorically stated by the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Israel has pledged to help evacuate the babies in these hospitals, but that has not happened so far. Heartbreaking images have been emanating from Al-Shifa. One of them of 7 babies bundled together in a green piece of cloth, and others with tubes sticking out of them. The 7 are among 39 born prematurely, weighing less than 1.5 kilos each. Each of them should be in incubators so that their body temperatures can be regulated. Instead, they had to be moved to ordinary beds, placed side by side and covered by packets of nappies and cardboard boxes of sterile gauze. Why? Because there is no more fuel to run the generators that power these incubators. Doctors at Al-Shifa Hospital are refusing a mandatory evacuation order from the Israeli Defense Forces. They warn that hundreds of patients will die if left behind. Here's what ground reports from Al-Shifa suggest. Tanks are surrounding the hospital from all directions. Access in and out of the hospital is impossible. Even moving from one building to another inside the hospital compound is a huge risk. People at the hospital are dying because there's no electricity, water or medicine. On Monday, Mark Regev, a senior advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, said an IDF attempt to deliver 300 liters of fuel to Al-Shifa had failed because Hamas had refused to accept it. This is something Hamas denies. Hospital authorities say the fuel being offered by Israel would anyway last just about half an hour. That's because at least 10,000 liters of fuel a day is required to run the hospital. Israel has accused Hamas of having a command and control center underneath Al-Shifa. Hamas and the hospital authorities deny this. Attempts to evacuate staff and patients from Al-Quds Hospital were thwarted due to heavy fighting as the Palestinian Red Crescent Society has reported intense gunfire near the facility in Gaza City. According to the health ministry in Hamas-run Gaza, Israel's relentless airstrikes and ground offensive have killed at least 11,200 Palestinians, most of whom were civilians. At least 40% of them, that's over 4,600, were children, and 3,100 were women. US President Joe Biden has said that hospitals in Gaza must be protected. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has acknowledged disagreements within the State Department over the approach to the war. His email to personnel comes amid growing dissent and differences across the Biden administration. There is growing anger and outrage over Israel's pounding of Gaza, with the death toll rising every day. Not only in Gaza and the Arab world, but increasingly around the globe, including in countries that have come out in support of Israel in recent weeks. These now seem to even include the United States, Israel's closest ally, where not only President Biden's opponents and critics, but even people within his own party now seem to believe that America's position of unqualified support to Israel's war in Gaza, and by extension, the killings of thousands of Palestinians, is simply untenable and unacceptable. Of course, Israel steadfastly refuses to call a ceasefire. The question we're asking on Global Lens tonight is this: how many more Palestinians will have to die before this war ends? Before Israel believes that it has avenged Hamas's 7th October massacre? Are 2.3 million Palestinians being collectively punished for the actions of Hamas? Can the international community remain a mute spectator to this humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented proportions? Do the Palestinian killings by Israel amount to a genocide and war crimes, as is being argued by many around the globe?
I have not been reluctant in expressing my concerns what's going on. And it's my hope and expectation that there will be less intrusive action relative to the hospital. We're in contact and we're with the Israelis. Also, there's an effort to take this pause to deal with the release of prisoners. And that's being negotiated as well with the Qataris are engaged. And so I remain somewhat hopeful, but the hospital must be protected.
In Gaza, fighting around Al-Shifa Hospital intensified over the weekend. In Al-Shifa Hospital, critical infrastructure were damaged, including water tanks, oxygen stations, the cardiovascular facility, and the maternity ward. 3 nurses were also reported killed. Many of the people that were in the hospital have fled or tried to flee. Some have remained behind. It's very difficult for us to establish how many are still in the premises.
Yesterday, we were informed by the hospital that the last 18 patients in the Rantisi hospital had safely evacuated to a safer hospital. This is because our war is against Hamas, not against the people in Gaza, especially not the sick, wounded, or the women, or the children. Our war is against Hamas, who uses them as human shields.
In Gaza, as ground operations by the Israeli Defense Forces intensify, the relentless Israeli bombardment continues, hitting civilians, hospitals, refugee camps, mosques, churches, and UN facilities, including shelters. The Secretary General is, and I am, deeply concerned about clear violation of international humanitarian law that we're witnessing in the ongoing conflict. Let me repeat the clear, unequivocal position of the United Nations that no party to an armed conflict is above international humanitarian law. Even wars have rules.
How much worse is this humanitarian crisis going to get? Let's understand this with our guests. Joining me on the show tonight is Hadil Kazaz. She's a Palestinian humanitarian worker with Oxfam. She joins us live from Ramallah in West Bank. Also with us is Professor Uriel Abulaf at the School of Political Science, Government and International Affairs. Joins us live from Tel Aviv. We're joined by Dr. Alexander Greenberg, captain at the IDF Military Intelligence, retired. He was with the research department. He joins us live from Israel as well. And joining me from Bengaluru in India tonight is Tammy Benheim, Consul General of Israel to South India. Thanks to all my guests for joining me on the show. As we have tried to do on Global Lens from the beginning of this war, we have tried to get voices from both sides because there's been suffering on both sides. I want to begin with Hadil Kazaz, who joins us from Ramallah in West Bank. Hadil, thank you very much for coming back on Global Lens. Today, Gaza's largest hospital, Al-Shifa, is being described as a mass grave, as a cemetery. God knows how many babies have died there. The images that we've seen coming out of there are absolutely heartbreaking. Can you tell us just how devastating the ground situation is?
It is absolutely a humanitarian crisis, and it's absolutely devastating and catastrophic by all means. To see this suffering that lasted actually not only for the last 72 hours, but since the beginning of the war, there was continuous attacks and bombardment and bombing to Shifa Hospital, which at that time had more than 70,000 evacuees or internally displaced people, as well as hundreds and hundreds of patients, and it was the only hospital which could help and deal with the serious injuries, including the biggest or the largest intensive care unit and the largest dialysis department and the largest infants incubators. So we have been witnessing intensifying of bombing in the last 72 hours, and it is absolutely understandable for anyone who watches from far away, especially for humanitarian actors like myself, to understand how this situation couldn't be dealt in a different way. What was the obstacle behind dealing with such a situation in a way that would save civilians' lives and help people who are in need of help to get the help they need? We heard pleas and complaints from the doctors in the Shifa Hospital over the days asking for an international investigation team, for the International Red Cross to intervene, for any impartial party to show up and to deal with the situation. But of course, nothing happened. We also heard pleas about how the bodies were actually in the yard of the hospital outside, because anyone who just emerged from the hospital buildings was shot, and dead bodies were in the outside yards of the hospital. We were not buried, and at a certain point we heard stray dogs were coming and attacking these bodies. This is not acceptable, especially when we are seeing this live on camera, and it doesn't seem that anyone is able to stop this madness, and there is no wise voice basically saying that this is not acceptable. Hospitals are protected by international law, and it's absolutely necessary for civilians to be protected, for infants to be saved, and for people who have kidney failures not to die immediately. We saw actually one of them who left Shifa Hospital, and he was saying he didn't have a dialysis for 4 days. This means a death sentence for him, and this is again not acceptable for any human being. Anyone needs the access to healthcare should receive it at all times. We also witnessed these doctors in the hospital who have been working around the clock. They couldn't have shifts, they couldn't have rest, they didn't have food, they didn't have electricity. And this was going for 39 days until now. Again, inhumane situation for workers, for staff, for doctors, for anyone who's in the Shifa hospital at the moment.
This is an inhuman situation, and frankly, Hadil, most of us cannot even imagine what Palestinians in Gaza are currently going through. But before I go across to my Israeli guests, I need to ask you this question. Israel says that Hamas is using Al-Shifa Hospital as its command and control headquarters. That is where its military infrastructure lies. Underneath lie those tunnels. And that is why they have surrounded this hospital. That is the reason why this hospital has come under attack. The patients and doctors and others are being used as human shields by Hamas. How would you respond to that?
First of all, we are a humanitarian organization, and we care and we deal with the civilians, and that's who we pay attention to. However, my response to that would be, why for 39 days this couldn't be verified by any other source? What the Israelis say hasn't been allowed to be verified or proven, or there is no evidence. It's just what we hear. And why this situation couldn't be solved for all this time? This is a question that we need to ask everyone about, and definitely we need to understand how the situation was allowed to reach this point. We care about the people, the children, the babies, the patients, including actually my aunt who was using dialysis in Shifa Hospital, and we lost contact with her. We don't know where she is at the moment. She may be as well dead, I don't know. So that's exactly what we are talking about. We are talking about these civilians, these people who are in such a dire situation that's not acceptable, that they don't deserve to be in this situation. This was the only hospital available for them. And out of the 35 hospitals in the Gaza Strip, 20 are out of function, totally, completely, they don't function. And then the others are in the south. And this means that anyone who's injured now is sentenced to death. It's basically a situation where no one can seek help, including a pregnant woman who wants to deliver, including people with asthma, people with diabetes, anyone who has severe illness before. Basically, you are talking about almost 12,000 dead people who are counted for. But there are many more we don't know about.
Okay, so being ill or injured today in Gaza is a death sentence. I will come back to you, Hadil. Let's get a response from our Israeli guests. Let me start with Tammy Ben-Haim. Tammy, thank you for coming back on Global Lens. Let's look at some hard statistics, and these are very, very heartbreaking as well. We know that more than 11,000 Palestinians, most of whom we are told were civilians, have been killed in the Israeli counteroffensive. More than 4,600 of them were children, more than 3,100 were women. Talking about Al-Shifa, the largest hospital in Gaza, it is being described as a cemetery today. 179 people, including many babies, have had to be buried in a mass grave. This situation is untenable, it is inhumane, and it frankly should be unacceptable to anyone with a conscience.
Yes, first, Neha, let me say, much of the information you've mentioned, I'm not sure where you got it and how you got it. It's a shame because it's very, very, some of the things you're saying are untrue. But let me start again. Ms. Hadil said she's calling on to the Red Cross. Israel has been calling on to the International Red Cross for 39 days now to talk about the nearly 240 hostages that they've taken. The babies, the children, the women, the girls who they're raping and brutalizing as we're speaking now. Even you did not mention this issue in your opening. So this is a fact that we should not ignore. Secondly, Ms. Hadil mentioned pregnant women. Absolutely right. The Hamas kidnapped a 9-month pregnant woman who gave birth either yesterday or the day before while in captivity, while being brutalized. Can you imagine the horror that she is facing? Can you imagine the horror, the grief, the heartbreak that her family is facing? Every one of those hostages what the hostages are going through, their unimaginable tie. You were talking about hospitals. Yes, Rantisi Hospital, which is a children's hospital that deals with children with cancer, was a hub for Hamas terrorists. And there's not one word against the other. Israel showed pictures, and you can see them, of the command center, of the weapons, of the belt, terrorist belt, explosive belts that they put on the hostages. There was a proof, there was schedules of the guards taking care of the hostages being in Rantisi Hospital, and same thing with Shifa Hospital. And not only that, that there's definite proof and intelligence that Shifa Hospital is the headquarters and the biggest storage and headquarters place for Hamas. What other army in the world, what other country in the world will say in advance where they're going? And you said people are fleeing the hospital? You're wrong. They're not fleeing. They're using, and IDF is assisting them and helping them move to southern Gaza. They're not fleeing. They have, the IDF has corridors. Hamas tries to stop these people from fleeing. Our soldiers are protecting Palestinian civilians and are trying to get them to the south where it's safe. And listen, and this is what you're wrong. You're right. We should be worried. Every death of a child is a sad thing. It's tragic. And the sole group, the sole people responsible for what is happening now in Israel and in Gaza and with the hostages is Hamas. So every question you have and every, heartbreaking story that Ms. Hadil told us and you told us, you have the person responsible. You have the terrorists responsible. They are the ones responsible. And let me say, like-minded countries care about civilians. That is why Turkey, Kuwait, UAE, and many, many other countries are sending ambulances, are sending doctors, are opening field hospitals. So all these patients who Israel is helping to move out, is guiding them, is protecting them while they're moving out to the south, are getting the care they need. And not only that, tons and tons, over 3,000 tons of medical equipment, of medicine, of food. Just today, over 100 trucks came in with all this, with water, with medicines, with medical equipment. And as I said, field hospitals from around the world. So Israel and the Israeli soldiers, everybody cares about civilians. You know who doesn't care about civilians? Hamas. And
I don't doubt that
you
one
open
bit.
the show and you don't mention 240 babies and children and girls, 12-year-old girls who are being brutalized by Hamas, it's a shame. And this is exactly what's happening. It's not the two. It's a country, it's a democratic country that has the obligation to care for every single one of its citizens against a terrorist organization that knows no rules, that knows no bounds, that knows no limits to their brutality. Even the video released today of poor 19-year-old Noah, who they show her talking and then show her body. Don't get sucked in
Can
into
I just say
this.
one thing
Don't
here?
get sucked in. You're much smarter than this. Don't get sucked
Okay,
in
let me
to
just
some
say
terrorist
this.
organization's
I
propaganda.
don't
I'm really
think-
asking you.
I'm sorry, Tammy. The question has never been about whether Hamas are terrorists, whether they are butchers, whether they are beasts, whether they are monsters, because the answer to all of those questions is yes. The only
Exactly.
question that we are confronted with today, I think, as a humanity is, are 2.3 million people of Gaza being collectively punished for the terrorist actions of Hamas? You questioned my figures
Absolutely not.
first and
Absolutely
foremost.
not. It's an
These are
easy
not
answer.
my figures,
Absolutely
Tammy.
not.
If I could just
No,
quickly
I'm telling
finish
you.
this.
Absolutely
These are
not.
not
There's
my
no
figures.
collective
You say,
punishment.
where am I getting these figures from? More than 11,000 people, most of whom are civilians, having been killed in Gaza. These are not my figures. These have come from Gaza, and these have been corroborated by international
Hamas. These
agencies
figures
like
come from
United
Hamas.
Nations.
Exactly.
No, Tammy,
No,
there are
these
organizations
figures
like
come from
United
the
Nations that
Ministry
are on
of
the
Health
ground.
of Gaza. No, we need to be clear here. These figures come from the Ministry of Health of Gaza.
Yes, they
the
do.
Ministry of Health of Gaza is Hamas. Now, a
And at the
terrorist in
same
civilian
time, the
clothes
United Nations
and a
and the World
terrorist
Health
with a press
Organization have
jacket on him,
corroborated these.
he's still a terrorist. Who the UN have, and we've seen the UN lately, okay? They have their workers there who are Palestinian, and we don't know what they are. Many of them have been complacent. Many of them have let these things happen. You're telling me that the UN workers who care for Gazans' health didn't know what's happening inside their own hospitals? didn't know for years that Hamas is building weapons. They let weapon storages. Do you know what would have happened if something blew up in these hospitals?
Okay,
You know the amount of weapons they keep in the hospitals?
let me
The
just
amount of weapons they keep in children's, in kindergartens? Think of a mistake,
You
not
know,
on purpose.
honestly,
If one of these would
I
have blown up.
have one point of disagreement with you, Tammy. Nobody denies that what happened in Israel on the 7th of October was absolute butchery. However,
It's still
when we
happening.
talk about the killings of Palestinians and we're instantly accused of peddling Hamas agenda, I object to that very strongly. None of us here are sitting in support of Hamas. I would be the first person to say, execute those terrorists if you can. But the question
This is
here
what we're
is
doing.
about the innocents who are caught in the crossfire and who are dying by the thousands. I do not think that in our conscience we can any longer turn a blind eye to this. The international community cannot. Your closest ally, the
Nobody's
United
turning
States.
a blind eye.
The United
Nobody
States
is turning a blind. Of
is
course,
not doing
United
that
States
anymore,
cares
Tammy.
about the civilians.
The United States
United
is not
States
doing
cares.
that anymore. Okay, let me just get a word in from the other Israeli guests and I'll come back to you. Dr. Alexander Grinberg. You know, it is well known that under humanitarian law, hospitals are protected. Israel says we are not going after hospitals. We're not going after civilians. The Biden administration, in fact, President Biden himself has said hospitals must be protected. But here, hospitals are under attack and people are dying. Al-Shifa, the largest hospital, is turning into a mass grave. How much longer can Israel justify this?
I fear I slightly misunderstood you. First, you said it's a mass grave and it's heartbreaking. So I understand that the mass grave of Israeli butchered citizen was, I believe, less
Both
heartbreaking.
can be equally true,
Why?
sir.
Because of
Both
silent.
can be true.
As,
Both can be true.
you-
And my heart can break for both the Israelis who are butchered and for the Palestinians who are dying, sir.
So
There is
they're
no
dying.
contradiction.
There's only one responsible for their death. It is Hamas. And even CNN acknowledged that a U.S. official with knowledge of American intelligence says Hamas has a command node under the Al-Shifa Hospital, uses fuel intended for it, and its fighters regularly cluster in and around Gaza's largest hospitals. There proves, Israel provided proofs, and you know very well that if there had been any suspicion that what Israel says was not true, all the world and American media would only trumpet that. So this fight will continue unless Hamas surrenders and releases our hostages. If someone says that we are not supporting Hamas, of course, but we are against the death of innocent Palestinians, the person, in fact, wants us to be executed by Hamas, because this is what happens. As to the plaints of Palestinians, there is like Arab proverb, ضربني وبكى سبقني واشتكى. He bit me and ran to complain over me. So this is the same story. And again, the fight will continue till the victory. Hamas has all the means necessary to stop it immediately, to release our abducted persons, including babies and pregnant women, and it will stop. If it does not stop, the fight will continue. We are doing that not to kill Palestinians, but to put down Hamas resistance.
But you are
That's
killing
all.
Palestinians is the point, sir. That when more than 11,000 Palestinians are killed, over 40% of whom were children, then you are killing innocent Palestinians who are not Hamas. That is the whole problem here. And can I tell you, sir, that today there is growing unease, even anger, even in the United States of America, even in countries that have come out in support of Israel. In recent weeks, they are increasingly uncomfortable being seen in Israel's corner because what is happening currently in Gaza is being described by many around the world as a genocide. How do you respond to a war crime with a series of war crimes is the question that Israel is being asked today.
Well, when Jews are butchered, it is never a genocide, and it rarely raises the concerns of the world, so we don't care about any outcry in the world, particularly when this outcry comes from countries and states that never give a damn to the life of their own citizens. And Hamas, if you remember, claimed openly that they're not responsible for the lives of the Palestinian civilians. So that's the whole story, and I don't think it is our problem. And if someone requires only from Israel responses to this situation, it's, I would say, at least there is a bias here.
I'm not sure what bias you're referring to, sir, because you may not care about the children who are dying in Gaza, but I think the world does. It's as simple as that. Let me now go across to Professor Uriel Abulaf at this point. Professor Abulaf, not only has President Biden said hospitals must be protected, and that is clearly not the case. You know, can I just tell you and my viewers this, that an email has been written by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken to the personnel in the US State Department addressing the growing differences and anger in America, within the US State Department and within the Biden administration over the approach to this war. And the reason I talk repeatedly about the United States of America is because they are your closest and staunchest ally. This is a country that has sent aircraft carriers to the Mediterranean in the aftermath of the 7th October massacre. But there are many, including in the ruling party in that same country today, who are asking how much longer can we support what are increasingly being seen as war crimes, as crimes against humanity, and as the genocide of the Palestinian people. How would you respond to that?
I think that according to international law, it's very hard to depict what the IDF is doing in the Gaza Strip as a war crime. For a war crime, you have to deliberately target civilians, and I've seen no proof whatsoever that the IDF deliberately targets civilians. It's certainly not the case that we're speaking about genocide. There is no goal to eradicate the Palestinian people. There is obviously very much a genocidal aim to Hamas. Everyone who reads the Hamas covenant can readily see the clear aim of genocide against the Jewish people. But that aside, if there will be any sort of evidence that Israel is deliberately targeting civilians, this is obviously abhorrent. And I haven't seen any such indication.
Okay, but you haven't answered my question. The primary question that I'm asking is, even if you want to keep aside for a moment what's happening in the United States of America, fact of the matter is that there is now a growing narrative around the world, including in countries that have come out in support of Israel, which says enough is enough. Too many Palestinians have died. So let me ask you this question, and I'm going to put the same question to Tammy. How many Palestinians need to die before Israel believes it has achieved its objective? How many more Palestinians need to die before Israel believes that it has avenged Hamas's massacre of the 7th of October?
It sounds like there is a certain presumption in what you're saying that the goal of the current war on the part of Israel is revenge. I don't think this is the case. We have to bear in mind Israel evacuated the Gaza Strip in 2005. Since then, there are no settlers, there were no soldiers in the Gaza Strip. There was an ample opportunity for whomever ruled the Gaza Strip to try and make it into a prosperous place. It hasn't been done. Instead, we know, and this is corroborated all over the place, that instead Hamas has taken over in a coup, military coup, in Gaza Strip, and has been using Palestinians themselves as human shields in order to attack Israeli civilians in Israel per se, no settlements, in Israel per se, as has horrendously happened in the massacre of October 7th. And I think your question is very much in place, however, in terms of how long, because what's going on is truly heartbreaking, and it's horrible. And I agree, this is the question that we should ask ourselves. And can we allow Hamas to keep on governing Gaza when we know that Hamas does not only declare its genocidal intention, but is doing its utmost in order to execute? So the question then becomes, how do we handle the situation? And in my mind, I think much of the troubles of all of us in addressing the war, in addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is that we keep on calling it an Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
No, actually, we are calling it Israel-Hamas war. We are very clear about that.
No, but let me try to refine it. When you introduced the four of us, you mentioned that you want to engage with both sides. And presumably the sides are Israeli and Palestinian. I imagine you didn't refer to some Israelis and the Hamas, right? You have no member of the Hamas.
Well, I don't talk to terrorists, sir. I have had the opportunity to interview Hamas operatives, but I refuse to give terrorists a platform on my show. So yes, I will not talk to Hamas terrorists, but I will talk to legitimate Palestinian voices. And the lady who joined us is not just a Palestinian, she's a humanitarian worker with Oxfam International. Just so we are clear about this.
I don't think that we have disagreement here. I think that you think that I'm saying something that I'm not. What I'm trying to say is that both Palestinians and Israelis have been hijacked by extreme governments. I'm talking about both Hamas and the current Israeli government. If you look at public opinion polls in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, the overwhelming majority of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, more than 80%, were against Hamas' intention to abolish the ceasefire that was before October 7th. Most of the Palestinians do not support Hamas. I would go further to say that most Israelis do not support the current Israeli leadership, especially Benjamin Netanyahu. I think that both Palestinians and Israelis can truly come together to try and overcome their extremist leaders in different ways. Hamas is conducting itself militarily, trying to target people. You can say different things about the Israeli government. And the task before the international community is to recognize it, is not to yield into simplistic thinking in terms of all Israelis or all Palestinians. That's obviously not the case. And we should all fight against Hamas militarily. And we should fight Netanyahu's government politically in order to bring about a better tomorrow. This is possible. Even amidst this carnage, there is a possibility of coming together into a better day.
You know, I don't disagree with some of the last points that you've made. I'm glad you acknowledge that a majority of Palestinians neither support nor are represented by Hamas. Yes, there is a lot of anger against Prime Minister Netanyahu at home. And I'm glad that you acknowledge that what is happening right now in Gaza is a carnage. But when you say let's not give in to, something simplistic, a simplistic explanation, you know, the problem is when thousands and thousands of civilians, including women and children, are dying, trust me, there is nothing simple or simplistic about it. We have to take a humanitarian view.
Exactly.
Nobody here supports Hamas. I want to put that on record. So let me go back to Tammy at this point.
Let's think together. What would be a viable alternative? I mean, ceasefire, for example, that's a possibility, right? To ceasefire now.
It is, but you know, collectively punishing 2.3 million Palestinians, I'm not sure that is the answer. When you say what is the alternative, I am not sure collective punishment is the answer. So Tammy, let me come back to you.
Now is a collective punishment.
It is a collective punishment. Look at what's happening to
Based on
Palestinians.
what? Based on what are you saying that?
You cannot ignore, sir, how thousands of Palestinians have been killed. Just like it is a reality that 1,200 Israelis were butchered by Hamas terrorists on the 7th of
Wait,
October and close
why
to
the analogy between
250
the two?
people were taken
You're saying
hostage.
that it was
It is
Israel's
equally
intention to
true
do
that
so?
innocent Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces. How can both, why can't both be equally true? Why can't I feel equally bad about both? Why can't I equally
course you
condemn
can.
both? That is a
course
simple
you
question
can.
that I ask, not just as a journalist, but as a humanitarian. And I want to go back to Tammy with this. Tammy, okay, let me put this differently. You agree that civilians should not die, but the unfortunate reality is civilians are dying. Israel says we don't want to attack hospitals, but the reality is that hospitals are under attack. You know, if it was just about Hamas operatives or terrorists being killed, I can assure you nobody in this world would be shedding a single tear for them. The trouble is that Palestinian civilians are dying, women and children are dying. So let me just ask you a different question. How do we deal with this?
We deal with it. You can cry, you can be sad, and the international community, and Israel is heading it, is trying to save every possible civilian life that we can. We are actually endangering our own military agenda against Hamas in order to save people's lives. And I'm glad you talked about the international community, but you forgot to mention today the very, very clear condemnation of the entire EU and all the EU countries against Hamas for using
Of course, everyone knows it.
hospitals
But
for
at the
its own
same time,
terrorist
people are
agenda.
now
They
concerned
came
about
out in a very clear
Palestinians
statement,
dying.
and now, and we exactly, we are trying to prevent this. Okay, in war, and it's horrible. And we saw the U.S. after 9/11, and we saw different. You know, when the world was looking for ISIS, it was an international coalition. War is sad, and war is bad, and war, makes us pay a price, and it's horrible. And Israel understands it most of all. We've suffered so many wars. We've suffered terror attacks. You've suffered in India as well, terror attacks. But I'll tell you again something I told you before. The 240 hostages that Hamas is holding now, the babies, and as I'm speaking to you, I got now a red alert because there's again sirens in Tel Aviv and the central Israel because Hamas is shooting rockets at us. That's a crime against humanity. The 240 hostages, I told you, if we do it percentage-wise, that would mean in India that a terrorist organization came from across your border and kidnapped over 32,000 children, babies, women, the elderly, and men. Would India just sit there and let the world just let the world say, okay, we'll leave our 32,000 civilians there because some people on the other side may die? Or we will do everything we can in our power to free those 32,000 Indians who are innocent, who did nothing and were kidnapped as hostages by a terrorist organization. Of course, India, like any other country in the world, every government has the right and has the obligation to save and secure its citizens. And this is what we're doing. We're not seeking revenge. We're not doing anything. We are fighting a terror organization, a brutal terror organization. And we and the international community are trying to minimize the damage to civilians. Hamas is happy with everybody who is killed. Hamas is happy for the destruction. Hamas is trying to cause more. This is what we need to understand, and we must destroy Hamas and its military capabilities and governing capabilities, obviously for the security of the people living in Israel, but also now we know and now we're certain for the 2.3 million people living in Gaza that you and I and everybody cares about. We want them to have a better life. We want them to have a future. We don't want them to be used as pawns in a terrorist sick mind. We want them to be free.
Okay, just for perspective, of course you're right, Tammy, that India has been a victim of terrorism for a very long time, exported by our neighbor, Pakistan. We had 26/11.
I can't hear a thing.
Okay, I just hope we can fix your audio. I will come back to you in just a moment, but as I was saying, we had 26/11, which was possibly the worst terror attack on Indian soil in our entire history. But just for perspective, Tammy, we did not bomb Pakistan to stone age. We need to be clear
But
about
you
that,
guys,
just
we
so our
didn't bomb
viewers.
anybody to Stone Age. You didn't have hostages. I, by the way, was in India during the time of this
Our
horrible
people
attack.
were held hostages
I
for 3
talked to the
days.
hostages. I talked to the hostages in Nimran House. Okay,
Yes.
to the Jewish hostages in Nimran House before they were killed. Nobody was taken across the border in this instance. It was a horrible, awful attack. So you know the pain, and you know that these terrorist organizations need to be stopped, especially as they say that they will do it again the first chance they get. They need to be stopped. Full stop. Nothing more.
Okay, let me take this to Dr. Grinberg. Dr. Grinberg, you know, the question is simply this. If what Hamas did to Israel on the 7th of October was an act of genocide, a crime against humanity, and a war crime, and I agree with all of those things, it indeed was, how is the killing of innocent Palestinians, including women and children who are not Hamas, how is this not genocide? How is this not a crime against humanity? How is this not a war crime? Before you say we don't care, I want you to answer the very pointed question that I've just put to you.
Well, you're always, you keep going around the bush. And I tell you again,
No,
first,
sir.
do you
I'm
know
giving you
who
facts.
built Shifa Hospital? It was built by Israeli architects in the 80s. I don't care about how to call what Hamas did. Is it a carnage, genocide? I know only when the Arabs and Palestinians kill عليهم خيبر يا يهود وقد قتل اليهود واجب شرعي. It's a Sharia obligation, killing the Jews. Hamas rules Gaza. It's not a bunch of terrorists who hide within civilian population. They rule Gaza, and I'm sorry, I'm a former military officer and not a jurist. It's not my job to define and to distinguish between civilians and non-civilians. My job is to protect my population.
So then
And
let me ask you a
by
follow-up
all
question.
means
Let me ask you a
possible,
follow-up
just
question.
you cannot imagine President Roosevelt saying Arnhem during the Second World War must be protected and has called for less intrusive action by British forces in Holland. Do we find it?
I want to
No,
ask you a
no,
question.
no.
You've talked about protecting your people. You've talked about, and Israelis have talked about, their exercising their right to self-defense. The question that many are today asking is launching an assault on 2.3 million people self-defense? Is killing thousands of women and children and babies self-defense? Is that Israel's definition of self-defense?
Of course it is. We're not talking about my personal self-defense. No normal country can stand the existence of this enclave or statelet ruled by terrorist organization who withheld our abducted citizens. That's all. And again, when a state carries a war, so it's the job of those who hide within civilians and to use them and human shields to protect them and to let them go. And Hamas didn't let them go. Moreover, when Israel suggested fuel portions to Shifa Hospital, the doctors refused to get it because the Hamas forbids them to take fuel from Israel because Hamas uses fuel for their needs. That's all.
Okay, Al-Shifa Hospital authorities have denied this. They also say, by the way, that the fuel that Israel has offered would run out in half an hour because they need 10,000 liters of fuel to run that hospital for a single day. But let me now go across to Professor Uriel Abulaf. Professor Abulaf, I come back to the question that I put to you earlier and that I put to Tammy earlier. If we are all convinced that we do not want to see innocents dying, then the question really is, what is the way ahead? Prime Minister Netanyahu says no question of a ceasefire till all the hostages are returned. Hamas says hostages will be returned, or at least we can talk about their return only once there is a ceasefire. It's another matter that the Prime Minister has also hinted that some sort of a deal may be in the works. But my question simply is, how do you resolve this stalemate? Because I have to keep saying this, people are dying every day, and most of these people are not Hamas terrorists. They're civilians, they're children, they're women.
Yeah, I don't know the exact numbers of civilian versus Hamas terrorists who have been killed, but there are a lot of civilians dying, and it is heartbreaking.
I'm glad you acknowledged that. Thank you for saying that.
As you said, even without being a humanist, just by being a human being, if you see women, children, elderly, or just men who are not part of the Hamas machinery dying, this is horrible. It's horrible, and I'm also not the one to blame the Palestinians for electing Hamas. Israel is elected Netanyahu's government, and I think Netanyahu's government is doing horrible things, for example, in the West Bank. And I'm not going to support it because I am in Israel. And I think that there are many, many Palestinians today who see what Hamas brought on them, and saw it even before what has been happening over the last month and a half. And they abhor the Hamas, and they would like Israel, but not only Israel, the Palestinian Authority, regional actors such as Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the international community at large, the US, the European Union, China, India, major actors to come together in order to create a better day. And I would like to say that I think it is possible. And it is possible, I believe, because both Israelis and Palestinians, we who are on the ground, we who experience all of that, and I think, Tommy gave you an analogy to India, and you mentioned the 2008 Mumbai massacre. And look, in terms of the analogy, imagine about 150,000 civilians, Indian civilians dying in a massacre, okay? The way that India would have responded to that in terms of the sheer numbers who died in 2008. Now, I think there is a way out of it. And the way out of it is coming from the acknowledgement of both Israelis and Palestinians that they have been, we have all have been, abducted by our extremes leadership. And there is a way to go beyond that. If there is a common pledge, yes, to create an independent Palestine, I'm all in favor of that. A demilitarized, democratic Palestine on both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, guaranteed by the international community and supported partly by funding initially. There is a sort of a need for a Marshall Plan now in the Gaza Strip and possibly in the West Bank as well, in order to create a viable polity where moderate Palestinians can truly build together a state that will live side by side peacefully with Israel. All of this is possible. And there could be, amid all of that, there could be the return of the captives and some Palestinian prisoners who pledged for peace. There is a way to go about it. And I think that here we need the support of all the international community and to understand that there is no clear-cut dichotomy between righteous A and an evil B. That's not the way it goes. On both sides, there are people who are good. They are the majority, not the extremists. And the international community should come and support them. Now, calling right now for a ceasefire before Hamas is down, I believe is a mistake. It is a mistake because currently there is no other military force that can bring down Hamas. And Hamas will not go willingly out of the Gaza Strip. They will use their people, their Palestinians.
Okay, I'm really glad that you've... Okay, I'm really glad that you've said some of the things that you have, because we all, I think, can agree that there are good people on both sides, and you agree that perhaps ultimately the two-state solution is the only solution. However, right now we need to think about how to end this war, how to end the killings. It's also interesting what you said about Prime Minister Netanyahu's policy, especially in the West Bank, which you are critical of, which many have been critical of. Tammy, since you were upset with me earlier, I will give you the last word. And I want to assure you that my intention is not to apportion blame or to point fingers. Can you hear me, Tammy?
Now I can.
Okay, so I was just saying, since you were upset with me earlier on the show, I will give you the last word as we wrap up this discussion. And I want to assure you that my intention as a journalist is not to apportion blame, not to point fingers. It is to have a dialogue, because if I had any kind of bias, I would not have so many Israelis on my show night after night. So I will just ask you to wrap up this discussion for us. What do you think is the way ahead? There are growing calls for a ceasefire from multiple countries and, of course, the United Nations. Do you see any possibility of that in the foreseeable future?
Sure. The Hamas can come tomorrow morning, give us 240 hostages, and everybody will talk. Absolutely.
That's what it'll take, the release of all the hostages. And it's interesting what Prime Minister Netanyahu said over the weekend, that a deal might be underway. Could that, in fact, involve the release of some Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails? We will probably have to wait to find out. But on that note, thank you very much, Tammy Benheim, Dr. Alexander Grinberg, Professor Uriel Oberlof, and of course, Hadil Kazaz, who joined us earlier on the show. Thank you to all of you for joining us, for sharing your perspective with us on what is clearly the biggest international story of the day and an issue that continues to cause massive concern around the world. All we want to see is an end to this war. Well, that's all the time we have on this edition of Global Lens. If you have been, thanks for watching.